So Palm Sunday marks the beginning of this week we call Holy Week. It is a week of recalling and reenacting the central story of our Christian faith, the story of Jesus' death and resurrection. So many of us will gather together at church multiple times this week, as there's almost always something going on to help us dig deeper into the story of God's redeeming love for us. In fact, Holy Week is supposed to be this special time of intense focus on the saving acts of God. It's supposed to be a time of reflection and prayer. It's supposed to be a time when all of the distractions of the world are put aside for a little bit so that we enter more fully into the story of Jesus' death and resurrection for us. And yet, over the years, I have found that this time of year is really not all that great for having a special, intense time of focus. And that is because right before Easter is always also the Feast of Spring Break. And many of us are on the road traveling or vacation, or if your kid is at the right age, out visiting colleges. It is not a time when you're just hanging around the house. Right before Easter is also a time that is usually full of distractions. We are getting ready, most of us, for Easter dinners with families, preparing for graduations, or finally getting around to yard work and stuff that we can get out and do. And stuff pops up always whenever you get near a holiday that you're like, really? This? Mine was discovering a pinhole leak in my plumbing this week. Like something like that always happens right before you're trying to get something really important done. And the week before Easter is always a time that is still filled with all kinds of regular stuff we need to do. This is a time of year when your deadlines and pressures at work do not go away, and when everybody expects you on the day after Easter, unlike the day after Christmas, to be fully up to speed. For many of us, if not all of us, Holy Week is not a week that is a great place or a great time for quietness and reflection. Instead, it's usually a time in which we're, well, like we almost always are, busy, on the road, and distracted. Sometimes I wish we could celebrate Holy Week at a time when we weren't so busy, on the road, or distracted. But then I am not really sure when that time would be. On the other hand, maybe it's not entirely a bad thing that we're called to recall and reenact the central story of God's love and salvation when we are busy and on the road and distracted. Because actually, that's how it happened the first time. It was in the context of busy, on the road, and distracted lives that Jesus entered Jerusalem and accomplished our salvation. Consider, as we read the story in a few moments, that everything that happened on that Holy Week happened among people who were busy with all kinds of other things. They were distracted and busy with getting ready for Passover. The disciples are always wondering, where is it that we're supposed to do the Passover dinner? How are we supposed to buy the food? What's the menu? And in the end, they're so tired, they can't even stay awake. It's just like us during this time of the year. The disciples and everybody else were people who were on the road. Jerusalem had swelled with people on Passover break. That's when everybody came to Jerusalem. It was a big travel week. And like Jesus and the disciples, they were on the road from other places, needing to find a place to stay, and just generally trying to figure out which end was up. And Holy Week was happening among those people also who were distracted with all kinds of day-to-day issues. You know, notwithstanding getting ready for Passover dinner and stuff like that, the Romans had beefed up security, the temple authorities were still plotting against the disciples, and all of the regular day-to-day stresses that everybody was facing, well, they still hadn't gone away. And yet Jesus acted in the midst of all this. God was still at work, doing a new thing in their lives, even when they were busy, on the road, and distracted. So maybe, as we enter into this Holy Week, one of the most important parts of the message of Jesus' salvation for us is that God is always at work in our lives, even when we are busy and distracted and on the road. I mean, thankfully, God doesn't wait until we find a nice, quiet, reflective moment for God to act in our lives because, again, I don't know when that would happen in my life, but God doesn't wait. God acts in the midst of everything else. Always has, always will. For us, too, an important part of the message of Holy Week and salvation is that we also ought to be looking for God in the new and saving things and the new and saving things God is doing in our midst, especially when we are busy and on the road. You know, often I like to think of, and maybe other people do too, may think of like a time of spiritual exercise as this time of quiet, intense focus. But often, spiritual exercise is more like kind of regular exercise. Doing a little bit all the time is often better than trying to do one intense thing only once in a while. And if we wait until we can find that intense moment, we might never find that moment. And part of the message for us, too, in Holy Week is that often simple acts of following Jesus are most beneficial to us precisely at those moments when we are tired and distracted. You know, the disciples at the end could have said, you know, Jesus, you go to the Garden of Gethsemane, we're tired, we're going to take a nap. But they followed. They tried to stay awake. They took the time to listen and to serve. And they saw what God was doing in their midst. And sometimes the things that we do, even if they seem to be things that are small, things that are serving in ways that we're fitting in between a bunch of other things we're doing, those two give us glimpses of what God is doing, how God is acting, how God is working with us and in our lives in the midst of busy, distracted, on-the-road lives. Because most of the time we're busy, we're on the road, and we're often distracted. But in spite of that, Jesus is still working in our lives, calling us to listen, to follow, and to act, even when things are chaotic around us. So let's keep that in mind as we read together now the story of God's love and salvation for us, the Passion of our Lord according to Matthew.